Welcome in, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. I am Tristan Warner with Clockwork Sports. Today, we are covering the Week 2 main slate on DraftKings and FanDuel. Hopefully, your Week 1 went well. Let's keep it rolling into Week 2. We're going to start up top here at quarterback, and the top end of the quarterback position is not nearly as strong as it usually is, since Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts are all not on the main slate. So that makes Kyler Murray our top end option here at 7,500. Now, Kyler had kind of a rough week versus the Chiefs in Week 1. It was very much a blowout. They were down by 30-plus points at one point. But Kyler still managed over 20 fantasy points, and that was only on 193 passing yards. This is a much better spot, should be a more competitive game, and it has a 51.5 point total. The major concern with Kyler is, of course, his pass catchers, with Rondale Moore and Andy Isabella both getting ruled out again. We'll discuss some of his pass catching options a little later in the show, but I do like betting on Kyler to have a better Week 2 than he did in Week 1. Next up, we have Lamar Jackson at 7,400. Lamar is my favorite to lead the quarterbacks in scoring straight up this week. I think he's viable for cash or tournaments, whatever formats your preferred method for playing is. I think he's good for both options. He put up a modest 21.2 fantasy points in Week 1 versus the Jets. Now, despite this being a tougher matchup versus the Dolphins, I do like him to have better output, better production in this game. Kind of left a lot of meat on the bone. Only 6 attempts for 17 rushing yards. That's rushing attempts. And 17 for 30. Not bad passing, 213 yards. This is what we hope Lamar does in the passing game. It had 3 touchdowns too, which is really nice. We just need those rushing attempts and yardage to get up and hopefully get a rushing touchdown over here as well. I really like Lamar. I think he's the safest bet to lead the quarterbacks in scoring. And like I said, I think he's good for cash or tournaments. Next up, we have Russell Wilson. Kind of a tough Week 1. He still was able to get over 20 fantasy points. Not sure why this is repeated 3 times here. This is just one game versus the Seahawks. Did get 340 yards, so he got that 3-point bonus for the over 300 yards on DraftKings. Only 1 touchdown. So, I mean, a little bit of meat on the bone, like I said, with Lamar. Similar to Russell Wilson here. However, just his proximity to Kyler and Lamar, he's only 200 less than Lamar and 300 less than Kyler. I just feel a lot better about those guys' upside, so I'm okay passing on Russell Wilson, despite it being a good matchup versus Houston. We'll jump down to Derek Carr here. Now, Derek Carr gets that Arizona matchup that Patrick Mahomes absolutely smashed last week. Arizona has a terrible secondary, terrible defense overall, and they might be a team that we can pick on all year. So I really like Derek Carr in this spot. Was able to almost get 300 yards last week, 2 touchdowns, those 3 interceptions you never like seeing. However, this is a much easier matchup versus Arizona, like we mentioned, much easier than his matchup last week versus the Chargers. So I like Derek Carr to probably get over that 300-yard mark. I shouldn't say probably, but I like his chances to get over the 300-yard mark, have multiple touchdowns, and what should be a high-scoring game. I think the Raiders have a 28.5 point team total too, so there's a lot to like on Carr. The one concern with him, as you can see here, is projected ownership 13%. It's looking like he might be the highest owned quarterback on the slate. These are very early projections, so just keep an eye on this throughout the week. But anytime that Derek Carr is one of the higher owned quarterbacks, I think that should have your ears perked a little bit because he's not really a guy that has a ton of upside. This ceiling looks way too high. I think this is an aggregated projection set. Someone's got their ceiling projection way too high on Derek Carr. It's really, really hard for me to see him hitting 34 points here. And if he's going to come with the most ownership on the slate, I'm comfortable going elsewhere in tournaments. Although straight up, I do think he's a pretty good play. Trey Lance at 5,700, the next guy here. This feels a little bit maybe a little bit more than he deserves to be. I think I have him more in the 18.5, 19 fantasy point range with some upside too, because that rushing he had 13 rushes last week, which I think led, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that led all QBs in rushes, 13 attempts for 54 yards, and Elijah Mitchell is going to be out for an extended period of time. So I really think that, 15 rushes for Trey Lance is not out of the question. And 28 attempts in the pass game to 164 yards. If he can do this and add the rushes, the touchdowns weren't there last week. So zero touchdowns across the board. If he can bring in some touchdowns, then he's sitting pretty. Kind of I don't know if you guys saw the Bears 49ers game, but the weather was an absolute disaster. I think it is really hard to make any substantial judgments from that game for anyone really across the Bears or the Niners. I think it's kind of just a throwaway game. So I would take this with a heavy grain of salt, this 11 points that Trey Lance scored. I think that his floor is probably closer to 13, 14 in this game. And 20, 25 points as a ceiling, I don't think is out of the question. And really, if he gets over 100 rushing yards, gets that 3-point bonus on DraftKings, I think he can absolutely push for 30 points. So Trey Lance in a really good spot. Weather should be a lot better, obviously. I like him to bounce back this week. Other guys I want to mention here, Joe Burrow versus the Cowboys, Matthew Stafford versus the Falcons. If you want to get a little bit crazier, I think you can consider Carson Wentz and Jared Goff in that Commanders-Lions matchup. Trevor Lawrence versus the Colts, and last but not least, I think Danny Dimes, Daniel Jones at 5,100 versus the Panthers. I think that he's at least somewhat interesting and super cheap. Super cheap. He was very efficient last week. I believe he had around 18 points. He had 18.02 points on only 21 attempts. And he did have 6 rushing attempts, which Daniel Jones can do. He can get 5-6 rushing attempts, even push for 7-8 sometimes. So I think that Daniel Jones at 5,100 and a pretty decent matchup versus Carolina, I think he can pay off this price tag. So as far as cheap options go, I'll say below the guys below 5,500. I think Daniel Jones might be my favorite. So pretty interesting spot there. Let's move over to running backs. I'll start at the top. Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor had 31 carries and 7 targets last week. That's 38 opportunities. That is just wild. Almost 40 times he was able to touch the ball. Surprisingly, Colts were trailing as 7-point favorites versus Houston. They were trailing for a lot of the game, so maybe the 7 targets is a bit of a ceiling for Jonathan Taylor, but his role is simply unmatched. He needs to be considered every week. He did get bumped up $800 this week. He's sitting at 9,900, which is really hard to get there. I think that he'll probably be 5 digits next week. But needless to say, Taylor is one of the stronger bets to be the highest scoring running back this week straight up. So I think you can always consider him. Next up, we have Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey slightly underperformed last week, and really it was the volume just wasn't there. He was able to salvage with the touchdown. He got 15.7 points. Without that touchdown, he gets under 10 points though. So it could have been really, really bad. Only 10 attempts on the ground and only 4 targets. It's a little bit concerning. I'm going to throw it up to game script and playing the Browns. The Browns play really slow. They run the ball a lot. So maybe it's possible that this is just kind of a blip on the radar. I'm not going to lie. I am a little concerned, but I do expect him to be in that 18, I would say 18 touches is probably his floor from here on out. And with the ceiling of 25 touches. And if this continues, I'd be really concerned, but I'd be also really surprised if he gets less than, 18 touches this week. So I like McCaffrey to bounce back. Next up, Alvin Kamara, 7,400. He's questionable. It's a tough matchup versus Tampa Bay. So I would just wait and see for Kamara's status on Sunday. But as of right now, I'm very comfortable skipping over him. Next up, we have Saquon Barkley, 7,300. He was deservedly one of the highest owned running backs on the slate. He was just criminally underpriced last week at 6,100, and he delivered 36.4 fantasy points. He had 18 rushes and 7 targets for 25 total opportunities. It seems like it's only a matter of time before Barkley is 8,500. So still, even at 7,300, he got raised up $1,200. Even at 7,300, it's simply too cheap. So he's likely one of the highest owned running backs on the slate. You can see these projection sets have him averaged out for about 27 projected ownership. That's highest in for the whole slate. So he's going to come with some ownership, but honestly, I think it's chalk. I don't mind eating, and I'm pretty certain he's a lock in cash games. If you're going to be playing cash games, I don't see how you don't play Saquon Barkley. So really, really strong play. Maybe you want to get different in tournaments. Where he is going to be, highly owned. But as far as cash goes, I think that he's a starting piece. Joe Mixon, 7,200. Incredible week 1 role and very surprising 9 targets. Mixon was not that heavily involved in the pass game last year, and I should have went back and checked, but I'd be willing to bet that he did not get 9 targets in any game last year. Again, don't quote me on that. I forgot to go back and check, but 9 targets is insane for him. Bengals are facing the Cowboys next week, who are without Dak Prescott. You'll get Cooper Rush at the quarterback spot. So I'd really expect the Bengals to be playing from ahead. I think Mixon probably regresses in the target category. It's hard for me to see him getting 9 targets again, but 30 carries in this game is not out of the question, and Mixon is a guy who's always a threat for multiple touchdowns, so I really like him in this spot. He should be somewhat popular, but like Barkley, I think that Mixon is just too cheap for his role in this offense. So I really like both these guys, Mixon and Barkley, both slightly underpriced in my opinion. DeAndre Swift, $7,000, very overly efficient in my opinion. 175 total yards on 15 carries and 3 targets. Swift is never going to be the bell cow running back in this current offense with Jamal Williams there. And it's obvious Jamal Williams, I think he had multiple touchdowns last week. Let me double check this, but and multiple carries inside the whoops. Let's see if I can't type out Williams. Oh, my keyboard has decided to not work, so that's really good timing. Let me just let me see if I can just find him. This is great TV, I know. Jamal Williams, 11 rushes and had two touchdowns. So you can see that DeAndre Swift, even though he put up a good amount of points, he still left some upside on the field because those 2 touchdowns went to Jamal Williams. Obviously Swift is so much better than Williams, but they're just not. He's not going to play 90% of snaps. He's not going to play 80% of snaps. So it's just something to be aware of with Swift. He's projecting for 15 to 20% ownership here, and if that's the case, I feel a lot better just going to Mixon for $200 more, less ownership, or just eating the Barkley chalk. I think that's fine. But just at their current roles, I think that Mixon and Barkley are so much safer and maybe a little bit more upside just with how many more touches they're expected to get on a week-to-week basis. So I do think Swift is a pretty good play, but I think the guys around him are a little bit better. $6,900 for James Conner. James Conner was incredibly inefficient in week 1, 10 carries for 26 yards. However, he did have 6 targets. It needs to be mentioned, too, he lost playing time due to the massive blowout against the Chiefs. In a more competitive game, which this should be against the Raiders, I think he can flirt with 20 touches on a weekly basis. I just think he's a tier below Mixon and Barkley, but his game environment is better than both of theirs with a 51.5 point total. So Connor will make my tournament pool. I think I prefer, like Swift, I prefer Barkley and Mixon a little bit ahead of those guys, but I do think that they're both in play. Leonard Fournette, $6,700. Resumed his role from last year. He had 21 carries and 2 targets. He is nursing a hamstring injury this week. He was limited in practice on Wednesday and Thursday. So keep an eye out for the Friday practice report. I'm filming this Friday morning, so you'll have to do that on your own. But he is facing the Saints, not the best matchup right now. How things stand, I'm kind of comfortable fading Leonard Fournette. Next guy we'll talk about, Javonte Williams, $6,500. He led the Broncos in targets with 12. He had 12 targets last week, but he did get out-carried by Melvin Gordon, but maybe largely that was due to Denver trailing most of the game. You'd expect them to bounce back versus Houston. Not to mention this is the same defense that Jonathan Taylor just went off on. Williams' role, obviously not nearly as good as Taylor's, but I think he's in a great spot to get 20 touches. My concern for him is slightly higher ownership. You could see him creeping up towards 20%. So if he's going to hold that ownership, I think I'm going to go elsewhere in tournaments. But on paper, I think that he's a really solid play. Next up, we'll jump down to Josh Jacobs at $5,800. The reason I want to discuss him, I think that he is great leverage off of Derek Carr, who, like we mentioned with the quarterbacks, is expected to come in highly owned. Jacobs only had 10 carries and 1 target last week, but they were playing from behind versus the Chargers. Raiders now, like we've mentioned a couple times, get a much easier matchup versus the Cardinals. You'd expect them to play from ahead. They're 5.5 point favorites. Jacobs probably won't be too heavily involved in the passing game, so I wouldn't include him with Derek Carr, and you're also hoping to get that leverage off of the highly owned Derek Carr. If Jacobs can steal a rushing touchdown or 2, steal all of those points away from the rest of the offense, because Devante Adams is going to come with a lot of ownership, like we'll discuss in a bit. So I think that Jacobs makes for a really, really interesting leverage play off of those 2. Daryl Henderson, $5,700. This is one of the most surprising storylines as far as running backs go for week 1. He had a bell cow role. I mean, there's really no other way around it. He had 82% of snaps, 13 carries and 5 targets. It's a very tough matchup versus the Bills. They were playing from behind. Otherwise, I think that those carries, he's probably in the 16, 17, even 18 carry range if the game is more competitive. Cam Akers behind him did not look good. So I think that this role for Henderson is sustainable, which makes him incredibly cheap and probably makes him the best value for running backs on the entire slate. I think that he's going to be heavily owned. I forgot to check his ownership. Yeah, you can see 22% to almost 23% here. So he's right up there with Saquon Barkley, close to Barkley. So expect those guys to be highly owned. And honestly, I don't have an issue with it because I think they're both really good spots. I think Henderson is a really strong cash play. Maybe you don't want to play Barkley and Henderson together in tournaments because you're just playing into a ton of ownership. But individually, I think that they're both awesome plays. So other running backs that I think you can consider, Antonio Gibson. He had 14 carries, 8 targets, and played on 64% of the snap. He now gets a Lions team that just gave up 4 rushing touchdowns to the Eagles, and the Eagles are a really good rushing team. The Commanders are not as good of a rushing team as the Eagles, so take that with a grain of salt, but Gibson is in a good spot, I think. Excuse me, Gibson is 5,800, by the way. Another one, this is honestly more surprising than the Daryl Henderson one, was Rex Burkhead. Rex Burkhead, who played ahead of fourth-round pick Dameon Pierce. He got 14 carries and 8 targets, and he played 71% of snaps. And they were playing with the lead for the majority of the game versus the Colts. This matchup versus Denver is not very exciting for Burkhead, but Burkhead's only 4,900, and if he's in line for 20 opportunities, then he needs to be considered. I mean, 8 targets in a game that they were leading for a lot of the time is wild. So I don't think double-digit targets is out of the question for Rex Burkhead. The coach came out and said that Dameon Pierce has some stuff to work on. So I think that Burkhead is the starting running back for the Houston Texans, and at his price, I think he's worth considering. So last one we'll discuss here for the running backs is 5,100 Jeff Wilson. Like I had mentioned earlier with Trey Lance, Elijah Mitchell is out for an extended period of time. Jeff Wilson is in a good spot on paper. I just have a hard time trusting these San Fran running backs when Trey Lance, Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk are all used pretty regularly out of the backfield, especially Lance and Deebo. Still Jeff Wilson, the pricing is intriguing, and he has a potential for 15 plus touches and a good matchup. They're home favorites, so he can't be ignored. But I do have my concerns. All right, let's jump over to wide receiver. Cooper Kupp picked up right where he left off last season. 15 targets, 13 receptions, 128 yards, and a touchdown. Literally, my only concern with him is pricing. He jumped from 8,500 up to 9,900 here. I wouldn't argue with anyone that wants to play him. He's a phenomenal play. But however, I have a tough time getting up to him. I just think that there's really good values and guys that have at least somewhat similar upsides to Cooper Kupp for a lot cheaper. So I'm struggling to find myself getting up to Kupp. He is coming with 14% ownership too. It's not low, not super high. Just tough for me to pay close to 10K for a wide receiver when I think we can find guys that $2,000 cheaper that have similar upsides at least. I won't say the same upside, but similar upsides. So. Devante Adams, 8,600. He is likely going to be the highest owned or one of the highest owned wide receivers on the slate. Not only is it a fantastic matchup versus Arizona, but Devante also mentioned in an interview this week that this is the first time his grandparents will see him play in the NFL in person. And if you haven't seen the video, go watch it. You could tell he's like really giddy to have his grandparents there. So if you're into those sort of narratives, it just makes Devante an even better play because on paper he's already a fantastic play. 17 targets last week, 10 receptions for 141 yards and a touchdown. It's really, really hard not to like Devante this week. I think he's absolutely in play for cash games even. So $8,000 next up for Jamar Chase, who had a fantastic week 1 with T. Higgins going down with the concussion in the first half. Kind of a weird situation with T. Higgins. Higgins was listed out for Wednesday's practice due to a concussion, but then he missed Thursday's practice for personal reasons. Like I mentioned, I'm recording this Friday morning, so something to be aware of. Go check Higgins' Friday practice report, because if Higgins is out, then Jamar Chase would be a lot more interesting. I think Hayden Hurst, who we'll talk about a little later, would be a lot more interesting. But yeah, so I think that that's a pretty big news piece that we need to keep an eye on. Jamar Chase, 16 targets, 10 receptions, 129 yards, and a touchdown. Fantastic game. And if T. Higgins is out, again, it's hard to not see him getting close to that same production. Next up, we'll go to Mike Evans. Mike Evans was a non-participant at Thursday's practice, and Chris Godwin is already expected not to play. So if they both miss, Julio Jones, who looked really good week 1, and Russell Gage would be the main beneficiaries if Evans were to miss this game. Like I said, we don't know. We don't have information on this yet, so make sure you're checking on Mike Evans' status. 6,700 for Michael Pittman. Let's see here. Pittman, very good week 1, and he was highly, highly owned too. He was way too cheap last week. He was 5,500. His price got bumped up $1,200. I think he's fairly priced now, which still keeps him in play. You can see he had 13 targets, 9 receptions, 121 yards, and a touchdown. He gets a really good matchup. I do like him. He is going to come with some ownership again, around 14%, but it's a good matchup. 13 targets is not out of the question. I do think that the Colts will play from ahead, whereas week 1 they were playing from behind, but it should be somewhat competitive. I still like Pittman to get some chances. It was a much, much stronger play for him in week 1, but I do think he's in play for week 2 here. 6,500 for Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's a target machine. He had 12 targets last week, turned that into 8 catches for 64 yards and a touchdown. Weekly double-digit targets is not out of the question for Amon-Ra. He's kind of formed like a Kupp-like connection with Jared Goff. He's especially enticing on DK, on DraftKings with the PPR format. And I don't think he's very highly owned. Yeah, coming in 10, 11% owned right here. So I think that Amon-Ra's in play for sure. Hollywood Brown. Marquis Brown at 6,200. Very disappointing week 1, especially, he's the clear alpha in that wide receiver room. He did get 14.3 points. It was salvaged by a touchdown because he only got 6 targets, only 4 receptions, went for 43 yards. Kind of really disappointing for how highly owned he was. I do think that this is a much better matchup for him this week. Rondale Moore and Andy Isabella were both ruled out again. Zach Ertz, there's just no way he's 100% healthy. And DeAndre Hopkins still suspended for the first 6 games. So I do like Marquise Brown to bounce back, and he's way less owned than he was last week. I'm going right back to the well with Marquise Brown. I think this is an easy way to get exposure to a high total game. So yeah, I like Marquise to bounce back this week. All right, we got these Denver wide receivers next. 6,100 for Cortland Sutton, 5,600 for Jerry Jeudy. Now, both had exactly 7 targets and exactly 4 catches, but Jeudy went for 112 yards and a touchdown, while Sutton went scoreless on 74 yards. Jeudy obviously had a much better week 1, and he's cheaper. So that I feel like undoubtedly he's going to be the field's preferred receiver between those two. So I like going with Sutton in tournaments, who potentially could be half the ownership. You see Jeudy here at 11%, and Sutton here at 6%, almost 7%. So, a little bit more than half the ownership, but I think there's such similar plays that, I'll just let the field decide for me. If they're going to go Jeudy over Sutton, then I'm going Sutton over Jeudy. If they're going Sutton over Jeudy, I'm going Jeudy over Sutton. That's a tongue twister right there. But yeah, that's the way I feel on the situation. Both are in a good spot versus Houston. I have no issues, going with either one of those guys. You could really do both too if you're going to stack Russell Wilson. Excuse me. In that same game, if you want some correlation, Brandon Cooks is $6,000 flat. He had 12 targets last week. He turned that into 7 catches for 72 yards. Houston did get some extra possessions in the overtime game, but 12 targets, that's awesome. He only converted seven of those, so clearly there's still some upside to be had, and he didn't get in the end zone, so that's even more upside to be had. You'd expect Houston to play from behind here, so I like Brandon Cooks, especially as correlation with if you're going to play Jeudy or Sutton. Another guy that had a really promising week 1, Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk is 5,700. He had 12 targets as well, like I mentioned. Only caught 6 of them. 50% catch rate. this just leaves a lot of upside on the table. And he went for 117 yards. Like, could you imagine if he had like 1 or 2 or even 3 more catches? I mean, if he's going to get 12 targets, there's going to be a week where he just absolutely explodes. I think he's a threat for double-digit targets and 100 yards every single week. And he gets Indianapolis, not really a matchup that scares you all that much. So I really like Christian Kirk. I'm going back to the well with him this week. We have 2 guys here that are really interesting at 5,500, Hunter Renfro and Allen Robinson. Both well underperformed projections or expectations for week 1, especially Robinson. I think Renfro makes for great leverage. In a similar way we were talking about Josh Jacobs, I think that Renfro makes for great leverage off of Devante Adams. Adams, like we mentioned, was approaching 25% ownership. Renfro was sitting at, I think he's around 7%. Oh, I'm sorry, a little bit higher. This was a little bit lower this week. So, just under 10%. But if you're going to get less than half the ownership on Renfro than you are on Adams, I think that's a very clear leverage spot. Allen Robinson, what was it? 1 target last week? I'm sorry, 2 targets, only 1 reception for 12 yards. Man, floor game of all floor games. I definitely expect him to bounce back this week. Sean McVay even noted that they need to get the ball to Robinson more. Robinson is also going to come in lesser owned than Kupp, and you save $4,400 off of Kupp, and it would not surprise me at all if Robinson was able to compete, just because I think he gets the ball more this week. So I really like taking my chances on Robinson. If I had to choose between these two, I like Robinson a little bit more. I just think his upside is a little bit better than Renfro. Let's move on. We got 2 Commanders wide receivers up next. Curtis Samuel, $4,600, and led the Commanders in targets last week with 11, despite playing behind McLaurin and Dotson in terms of snap share. Clearly, the Commanders are making the effort to get him the ball when he's in the game. It's a good matchup versus Detroit. I think he's going to come with a bit more ownership than the next Commanders receiver, Jahan Dotson. Dotson did have a really good week 1. It was his NFL debut. He had 2 touchdowns, but it was only on 5 targets and only on 3 catches. So obviously that's going to regress a little bit, but he was running as the number 2 wide receiver, only behind McLaurin. McLaurin had 90% of snaps and Dotson had 88% of snaps. That's really, really promising for a rookie in his NFL debut. And he actually got 1 more target than Terry McLaurin. 5 targets for Dotson and 4 targets for McLaurin. So I think it's worth mentioning they spent a lot of draft capital. Dotson was first round pick, if I remember correctly, was the 14th overall pick. And this week 1 role is very, very intriguing. He's in play for me, despite getting he got raised $800 for the pricing. He was much cheaper last week, but still, I think we feel better about his role now after we saw it week 1. So I think he's definitely in play. All right, as far as cheap guys go, we have Greg Dortch. I believe I'm saying that correctly. He is the main beneficiary from these absences for Arizona. You could see 9 targets last week for Dortch. Turned that into 7 receptions for 63 yards. A very impressive 13.3 performance without a touchdown. And he's $3,500. He's very, very cheap. Expect him to come with some ownership. But I think this is really good, cheap way to get some exposure to this game. So I like Dortch. As far as the receivers below like 4K, I think he's the best option. I think he's okay for cash games even, if you want to pay up some other spots. So definitely interested on Dortch, especially with Rondale Moore and Andy Isabella. I know I've mentioned that a couple times, but if those guys were playing, Dortch wouldn't even be in play. It's because those guys are out that Dortch is projecting pretty well. So other guys worth mentioning, Deebo Samuel, who saw 8 carries and 7 targets last week in that really terrible weather game like we were mentioning with Lance. So don't take it with a grain of salt. He was pretty inefficient, especially on the targets. He only had 2 catches from his 7 targets. So but like I mentioned, Elijah Mitchell is out. We could see him used even more in the run game. I do think he's pricey. He's $7,800, but it is a good matchup versus the Seahawks. I thought he was worth mentioning. Tyreek Hill, 12 targets in week 1. It's clear that they're really scheming to get him the ball. It's a much tougher matchup this week versus Baltimore than he had versus New England last week. But Tyreek, $7,100, I think he definitely needs to be considered one of the highest upside receivers in the game. DJ Moore, very disappointing week 1, only 6 targets, went for 3 catches and 43 yards. If he's going to be low owned coming off a dud, I'll definitely want some exposure. He's only 5,700, so I think that's a guy to keep an eye on as far as ownership goes. We got a couple guys on the Jaguars, Zay Jones and Marvin Jones. I think I slightly prefer Zay Jones. He's 5 years younger than Marvin and received 3 more targets last week, but both are cheap. They're both below 4,500. I thought they were worth considering. And then last thing I'll mention here is to the Giants wide receivers. Wendell Robinson is out for this game. Kadarius Toney is questionable. If Toney misses, Golladay, Shepard, and Richie James of all people, would be close to every down players. It would be hard for me to see Golladay and Shepard get less than 80% of the snap shares. Again, this is if Toney is out on top of Robinson. Robinson we know is out. Toney is questionable, so I think this is something to keep an eye on as well. Let's jump over to the tight ends. Excuse me. Mark Andrews, the top dog this week as far as pricing goes. Kittle is supposed to be out again this week, so I think he's believed to be out. I haven't seen any news on him, so I'm just gonna X him out. Mark Andrews, very disappointing week 1, 7 targets, 5 catches for 52 yards. On the positive side, he did lead the team in targets, and Lamar only had 17 completions. So, to get 5 catches on 17 completions is pretty good. He also played on 84% of the snaps, and I think despite this being a tougher matchup against the Dolphins, I think it probably suits Andrews better, because it should be a more competitive game. The Ravens were really leading that game the majority of the time last week versus the Jets, so Dolphins should be able to compete a little better, and I like Andrews to surpass his 5 catches from week 1. Darren Waller, 5,600. 6 targets, 4 catches. His 4 catches went for 79 yards, though. It's really good yards per catch rate. Like we've discussed with the other Raiders, this is a really good matchup versus Arizona. Waller is not projecting for that much ownership, 6-7%. I think he might be, out of all the guys we've discussed, I think he might be the best leverage off of Devante Adams, because out of everyone, I think that besides Devante, I think that he has the best chance to score 2 touchdowns. Now, if he scores 2 touchdowns, it's very unlikely that Adams is scoring 2 touchdowns or even scoring 1. So that's where you can see the leverage comes from. So I like Waller in this spot, only 5,600. Waller has double-digit target potential and 100-yard upside every single week. So I like Darren Waller in this spot. Kyle Pitts, very, very disappointing very disappointing production week 1. The issue with Kyle Pitts was always going to be quarterback play. You can see here he got 7 targets and was only able to convert 2 of them for 19 yards. That's just really, really tough right there, to get excited about. And it's not a good matchup this week. He gets the Rams. So I think if you want to play Pitts, it's really like a bet on talent sort of situation, and kind of just close your eyes and hope he gets there. He's not that highly owned, and with the lack of high-end tight end options on this slate, especially with Kelsey being out, I think you can definitely consider Pitts. He's a guy that can separate at the position. So I think Kyle Pitts is always in play, as long as he's at this price. I mean, 5,400 is not very expensive for how talented he is. All right, I'm going to skip over Dalton Schultz just with Cooper Rush as the quarterback. I struggle to like anyone on the Dallas side, so I'm going to skip over Dalton Schultz. TJ Hawkinson is a guy I wanted to talk about. Let's see, 7 targets, was only able to turn that into 4 catches for 38 yards. Hawkinson has some upside, though. He has big play potential. And I think he's probably more in consideration because tight end is sort of weak for week 2, but I do like Hawkinson, and I do think he's worth considering. This matchup, Detroit and Washington, is interesting. It's 48.5 point total. I could see it really going over that. So interesting spot there for Hawkinson. Next up, I wanted to talk about Tyler Higbee, 4,200, 11 targets last week, and only converted 5 of them. Stafford's a really accurate quarterback. Higbee runs his routes close to the line of scrimmage, so this feels a little bit fluky that he had a less than a 50% catch rate. So I like his chances to, 11 targets might be a little high, but if he can get 7-8 targets and turn that into 6 or 7 catches a week, I really like his chances to pay off this $4,200 price tag. Pretty good matchup versus Atlanta too, so I like Higbee in that spot. Other guys I want to mention, Albert O. Not even going to attempt the last name. in fear that I will embarrass myself. But very nice 6 targets for him, 5 receptions, 33 yards. Not a ton of yards, but he is a very athletic guy. I think that he has some upside. Very cheap, $3,700. So as far as the sub 4K guy goes, I think Albert O is one of the stronger plays. I like Albert O this week. Excuse me. I mentioned this a little bit earlier with Jamar Chase, but Hayden Hurst at 3,600, pretty good last week. T. Higgins did go out, so take it with a grain of salt, but 8 targets, man, and he's 3,600. If he gets 8 targets at 3,600, sign me up. So this is another situation where we need to keep an eye on T. Higgins. If T. Higgins is out, I'd feel a lot better about Hayden Hurst, and he might even be my my cash game tight end at that point. So definitely keep an eye on T. Higgins. Logan Thomas was another guy that was a bit surprising. Coming off the injury, he played 62% of the snaps and saw 6 targets. Only converted 3 of them for 45 yards. But I was really encouraged by the snap share being over 50%. I thought he might be closer to 50-50 with John Bates. But it's clear he's at least, getting close to full health. So I think that Logan Thomas, as far as cheap options go, is a really nice spot, and you're not going to get any ownership on him at only 5%. So I like that spot. Let's move over to defenses. Now, I will mention, if you wanted to play a really cheap guy, Isaiah Likely at 2,500, you're not going to get, no one's going to play him because he got 0 points last week, but he did have 4 targets. I know he played, I didn't write it down, so apologies for that, but I'm pretty sure he played around 40% of the snaps. Don't quote me on that. Look it up just to make sure I'm not talking out of my ass here. But if you wanted a really cheap guy, I think Isaiah Likely is okay. He does have a 0-point floor, so if he scores 0 points, don't come after me, because that is within the realm of possibilities. But if you do just want to punt off the position, I think you could do worse than Isaiah Likely. All right, defenses. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on defenses. For me, it's, if you guys are in my Discord, you know how I feel about defense. It's pretty much fade the highly owned ones. So in cash games, it's so simple. We're going Cincinnati Bengals versus the backup quarterback Cooper Rush and the Dallas Cowboys. They're just mispriced. It's as simple as that. They're 2,200. They're the obvious cash game quarterback. Now you see over 30% ownership on a defense. I am 100% going elsewhere for tournaments in week 2. It's the easiest fade of all time. If you're going to play Cincinnati into ownership, just with how volatile defensive scoring is, I think that's honestly just a straight up bad play. No matter the result, no matter if they come out and they score 20 points, they get 2 defensive touchdowns. No matter how you slice it at this ownership, I think they are a bad play. So my recommendation would just be to get different in tournaments. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're not already in our Discord, you should absolutely join. It's 100% free, and I'm constantly doing cash giveaways for sports trivia. We're giving away free content. We do fun games in there. We have people of all experience levels, so whether you're brand new to fantasy or you're a lifelong player, I think you'll find it very beneficial to be in there. And most importantly, I think it's really fun, especially on Sundays, where most people are just cracking jokes the whole time, and we're all watching the games. So I think it's a lot of fun. Thanks for tuning in again, and I'll see you next time. Good luck in week 2.